Let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, 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 welcome. So glad you're here. For those of you who are visiting with us, we extend to you a very warm and special greeting. We're thrilled you're here. We would love for you to be on our Thursday email blast, which I send out weekly. Just ask some people at any of these tables, and we'll get you on that mailing list. For those of you who are visiting, we'd love for you to pick up a red welcome bag on the edge of the campus or anywhere around. You can see a red welcome bag. They contain brochures about all the ministries at All Saints and an amazing array of speakers we have coming up this winter that will make you a different person. And we're glad about that. And for those of you who need a place to put your money, we would love to have your money here. All proceeds will be split with Greg Boyle. And I apologize for messing up the beautiful arrangement here, but I just pretend that it's even more beautiful. So let's get to work. Most of you know Greg Boyle. Greg, yes. Very appropriate, very appropriate. Greg, we've got about at least 100 people who stream in from all over the world, and so for their sake, I'm going to say that Greg grew up in Los Angeles. Fast forward, he became a Jesuit. Fast forward, he taught in Bolivia, in Mexico, was the head knocker at Dolores Mission. While there, responded to the '92 unrest, civil unrest, with those good people by starting a gang intervention program that matured and evolved into being Homeboy Industries, which now has several parts to the business, including Homegirl Cafe and food trucks and places in LAX and places in grocery stores where you can buy Homeboy Industry products. Please, please, please patronize them. Greg oversees the largest successful gang intervention program in the globe and has meant a great deal to this parish for many years and has been a close, reliable, spiritual soul friend of mine for the last 20 years. I think frequently of becoming a Jesuit myself, but there's a problem, I'm married. So, but when things get confusing and crazy, Greg Boyle is a great person to call with the clarity of thought and soul and heart that he has. So once again, please welcome Greg Boyle. So Greg, the arc of our conversation is going to be to get to your theology and what feeds it these days, and kind of a couple of ways in which to categorize it and describe it. But we want to start with Ferguson. So if you will simply let us into your heart and thinking about what happened when you heard about Michael Brown being killed in August and about the lack of indictment of the man who killed him on Monday night.
Well, first of all, it's always a privilege to be here with you. I feel at home here. I wrote Ed the other day when I read about his announcement that he was going to retire, that he was looking for Episcopalian and Anglican folk, and I said, is this ruling out the Jesuits? So apparently yes. Oh gosh, I don't know. You know, I think interesting thing about the grand jury is that they turned to Officer Wilson and they looked to him for the truth, and that he was kind of the sole possessor of the truth. And it's interesting why that happened. It wasn't because he was white. I think it was because he's perceived as the good guy. And equally pervasive is the sense that Michael Brown was the bad guy. And Jesus is pretty clear about this. He seems to say with an abundance of clarity that there are no bad guys. That as he walks quickly through Jericho and he's not staying, he spots Zacchaeus and he says, I'm staying in your house. Now we've domesticated that gospel so much, and we think it's about, personal sin and remorse. But it's really for the audience watching and horrified that Jesus chose to dine with the person who was in fact the poster child of the bad guy. I can remember here in Pasadena, I just spoke at Poly, and I got in my car, and on the radio, NPR was talking about the TSA agent who was tragically killed at LAX. And the reporter was asking a police officer, we understand that police have one bad guy in custody. Do they think there are other bad guys out there? Once I spoke at Sacramento, a huge kind of keynote to a bunch of people. A guy came up to me, handed me his card, and he was the lobbyist for the sheriffs in the state of California, and he said, I represent the good guys. And I think that's precisely there are a million issues you can talk about but these are all signs in the division that you find in terms of the great divide between the races, is that we still don't know how to stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. And we think there is such a thing as good guys and bad guys. And there's no Easter Bunny, and Santa doesn't exist. Sorry if you're young in here. And there are no bad guys. And so how do we imagine lives that are not our own? How can we look at Michael Brown and stand in awe at what he's had to carry, rather than in judgment at how he carries it? So no kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No matter how singularly focused we find ourselves attentive to those worthy goals, they actually can't happen unless there's an undergirding sense that we believe that we all belong to each other. I'm a little daunted by the flyer which I just read, Marcus Borg, Richard Rohr, Buddha, and Pope Francis. And so I'm out of my element. So
I'm going to lead you through it, brother. It'll be fine. So let's stay with the Ferguson thing a little bit longer, because I think that the light you bring about the whole business of dehumanization and the way we changed the metaphors in Los Angeles with the police after 1992 applies to this. So could you visit those thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think we have changed. We've made incremental change, and we've kind of the slow work of God, where we're at another place where we can entertain the idea that we belong to each other. I think that has been altered. They say if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor, and that's exactly, I think, what's happened in many ways in Los Angeles. Certainly from the top level, law enforcement. I'm heartened by Jimmy McDonnell, who's, I think, the most enlightened law enforcement official I've ever met in my life, and he's a friend who just became the sheriff, who always talks about compassion when he talks about crime, which is huge. And he always says cops need to know that they're encountering people on the worst day of their lives, which I think is enlightened. I had two homies in my car. I was taking them home, African-American gang member and a Latino gang member, and we got stuck in the traffic downtown because of the protests. And so it gave me an opportunity to ask them, what do you think this is all about? Walk me through it. Give me the timeline. And the African-American kid said, well, Michael Brown, earlier in the day, walked into a store and jacked a whole bunch of cigars or cigarillos or something. I said, okay, stop. Why do you think he did that? Now, a lot of people would answer that question by saying, well, he's a bad guy, he's a belligerent thug. They could answer it in many ways that strike a high moral distance and are the opposite of kinship. But he said very simply, yeah, he was just having a bad day, which I thought was pretty insightful. He said, yeah, he was having a bad case of the fuckets, he says. And I know nobody in this room has ever been afflicted with that. And then he said, and that led him to be walking in the middle of the street. And when Officer Wilson drove up, he said, get the F out of the street and get up on the sidewalk. Now, if he was a hopeful guy, he probably would have done it. But because he had a bad case of, I don't really care anymore, for whatever reason, we were off and running. And I thought it was pretty good. It was a very insightful kind of timeline that had high degree of reverence for how complex human beings are. In any way we reduce, racist cop, belligerent thug, we have to know that we're not even in the ballpark of acknowledging how complex people are. We're not in the city where the ballpark is. And I think that's important. And so we've made headway in the city, and I think we should feel good about that. I know from working with gang members that the rank and file still have a high degree of demonizing. It's still there. They'll mess with them if they discover that they're wearing a Homeboy shirt and they find out that they work at Homeboy. And so you choose to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. You stand with the disposable so the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Recently, I was at Notre Dame, and an African-American young woman and a Latina, during the question and answer period, they were really sort of aggressive with me, and they said, it wasn't really a question. I don't even know what it was. They said, oh, yeah? Well, what about police brutality? And what about mass incarceration? Well, that's not really a question, and when I get stuff like that, I sort of morph into a combo burger of Will Rogers and Mr. Rogers, and I get kind of, oh, shucks, and like I was from Mayberry or something. And I said, well, that's complicated, And then I said, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no peace. We think if you want justice, you have to work for peace, or no justice, no peace. No, it doesn't work that way. And the two of them looked at each other, like I was an old fart, which I suppose I am, and yet it was kind of young, and I get it. But we have to be patient with sort of the slow work of God and the long haul. If you want stuff quickly. And besides, Jesus never took the right stand on issues. He just chose to stand in that place, on the margins, because he knew that if you stand at the margins, look under your feet, a byproduct of your standing there is that the margins get erased. I don't know any other way to do it. But we want to stay here. We want to stay in the white paper and the policy, and it doesn't mean you don't do that stuff. You do that stuff. But kinship won't happen unless people stand at the margins.
So let's go back to that word hope. I've kind of taken it as a mantra from you about lethal absence of hope. Will you unpack that?
Well, I always talk about, the three profiles of young people who join gangs. There are only three, there aren't five, there aren't eight, The baseline is the lethal absence of hope. So the kid who can't imagine a future for himself, and consequently his present isn't very compelling. And if that happens, then you don't care whether you inflict harm. You don't care whether you duck to get out of harm's way, and you don't care whether you're walking in the middle of the street when a cop car comes by. The second profile is the kid who's deeply traumatized, hugely damaged, who can't see his way clear to transform his pain, so he just keeps transmitting it. And the third profile is the kid who's mentally ill, because it's on a continuum of severity. It can be more despondent than mentally ill, or more traumatized than despondent. But that's the profile. If we knew that to be true and we were confident in that, we'd infuse hope to kids for whom hope was foreign. And the only delivery system I know of is tenderness in loving, caring adults who show up and pay attention. And if we knew that to be true, we'd help heal the damaged and traumatized, and we'd deliver mental health services in a timely, culturally appropriate way. So this was my week. It began with a guy I knew named Giovanni who beat down a female MTA bus driver. It was on the front page of the Daily News. I've known him for 15 years. He texts me. He says, I effed up. I snapped. So I was going to take him to turn himself in on Saturday, but he ended up getting apprehended Thanksgiving morning. Hugely mentally ill kid, needs meds, bipolar. I've seen him snap multiple times. Wonderful kid. I'd be proud to call him my son, and he's really mentally ill, and I can't imagine how hard that is to carry. On Wednesday morning, a homie named Danny, who works in our office, was shot in the neck, is in critical care. I'm going to go see him right after this. I'm going to presume that the person who did it was at such a level of mental unhealth or huge trauma, or just didn't care anymore. Also on Wednesday morning, a kid I knew named Philip, who I've known for 25 years, father of 3. I buried his oldest son last year, was killed by a drunk driver. Philip, 10 years ago, was in a car accident, lost a leg. He and I have been through the wars together. And he jumped from his balcony to his death on Wednesday morning. What people have to carry is huge. I can acknowledge that the folks I work with all have to carry more than I've ever been asked to carry. I stand in awe. I stand in awe. And there are things we can do to kind of alleviate that, but nobody wants to talk about those things because we want to keep things rational and moral. Neither of those things help very much. One last image was Austin, Texas. The guy, white, middle-aged, who went on a shooting rampage, shot up the Mexican consulate and the federal building. And Art Acevedo, who I know, who's the chief of police there, a good guy, he said, you don't need to be a genius to put this one together, he says. He says, obviously, he was motivated because he was opposing the president's immigration executive order. And I said, wow, I would have thought mental illness, But that's where we go. We go, it has to be rational, it has to be moral, it has to be thought out. And there are people, buffoons on Fox News, who oppose the same thing, and they're not going to go on a shooting rampage because by and large, they don't share the same mental unhealth as this guy does. But why won't we talk about that? Because we want to keep and strike the high moral distance that separates us. That people are bad, that people are motivated rationally to do stuff, that they've willingly chosen to do something completely egregious, when in fact my whole week was filled with people who are struggling with mental health issues. And the criminal justice system is a poor substitute for our own failure in addressing that.
Let's talk about story. Everybody I've touched, or who's touched me, who live in your orbit, who live in the force field of Homeboy, put so much credence in telling their story, or retelling their story, or finding a different story. Talk about that, please.
Well, I think if you're, and we all need to be attentive and listen. You know, people come to Homeboy, and if you've come there to save them and rescue them, we're not that interested. A woman came once, I need to volunteer here. And I said, why? Because I believe I have a message these young people need to hear. I go, yikes. But if you hang out long enough and listen and receive people, I was in Houston recently, and a very earnest hardcore gang intervention worker said to me, how do you reach them? And I said, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. You know, can you be reached by them is kind of the key, it seems to me. Can you receive who they are? Because they're only going to know they're valuable because you chose to value them. So the other night I was having dinner with a homie named Lewis, who's worked there for 8 years, known him forever, and gang member, heroin addict. I had to let him go once. I said, you know, you're not ready for this program. Now he runs the program. And he's become something of a public speaker, so he's giving me tips on how to give a speech. And he said, you know, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. And, you know, gosh, I just wouldn't trade my life for anybody's, you know. But just, this one's fresh, you know. A homie came into my office, Rector, he's whatever he is, mid-20s, I guess. And he's very excited. It's the end of the day. He has a book. He comes in, he goes, I gotta read you this line. And he goes, it's from a book that we're all reading in the fatherhood class. We have a lot of curriculum things. So he comes over to my side of the desk and he shows me this book. And of the 2 pages, it's only one sentence is underlined. And it says, and he reads it out loud, fatherhood is an adventure. Well, I remember thinking to myself, well, that's kind of an unremarkable sentence, but I'm curious, you know, I'm intrigued why he thinks it's, I go, why did you underline that? So he comes and sits in front of my desk, is just beaming, smiling. He said, because every night I go home and I open the door and my 4-year-old son rushes me at the door and he wraps his arms around my legs. And he looks at me and he says, do you know what time it is? And I know to say, what time is it? And my son stands back and he says, it's time for an adventure. And he says, he always says the word that way, adventure. And so I got to think up some crazy ass adventure every night when I get home. And he's just beaming. And of course, I figure I'll go out on a limb here. I go, did you ever know your dad? He goes, nope. I said, you go home right now. Think up some crazy ass adventure for your kid, you know. And the degree of difficulty there is for folks like that to navigate their lives is so huge. And how different things would be if we could be reverent for how complex that task is, and how some folks are just handed more than anybody else, and how folks who are poor are handed even more, and folks who are of color are handed even more. And the minute we can see that, then the stories that we receive become these great gifts, and then they reach you.
So one way of talking about your personal theology, philosophy of life, is our kinship. And from time to time, you've told me that so-and-so is on your bookshelf, or he or she are the only people you're reading these days. And we've been talking a lot this fall about the responsibility we're feeling, I certainly am feeling, as a quote-unquote Christian priest, to rework the story so that it's life-giving, the Christian story. A new narrative, a new song. And you and I are reading a lot of the same people. Could you talk about our responsibility to do that? Maybe a couple of things about who you're reading. Sprinkle in Pope Francis and Buddha, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I knew we had to work that in because you can't advertise it. Everybody's here because they thought I'd talk about the Buddha. Every day I read anybody read Richard Rohr's little email things that he sends out? I always find those quite good. And of course I love St. Francis. I love the joy of the gospel. He could have said lots of other things, living our Catholic faith. No, it's the joy of the gospel. Once I read a bishop who was going on and on praising Cesar Chavez. He was a man who lived his Catholic faith. I go, no, I knew him. He was a friend. He lived the gospel. Please tell me living the gospel trumps living the Catholic faith. I think it has to. I hope it does. I'm a Catholic till the day I die. But living the gospel is what we're invited to, and we're supposed to be anchored in the joy of it. That's the hope. The spirituality at Homeboy Industries is kind of a combo burger of Ignatian spirituality with Jean Vanier and the L'Arche community stuff, with a side order of the Belgian Jesuit worker priests who just wanted to work alongside people and valued friendship with the poor. I read a lot of Pema Chodron, who I love. One day, this was surreal, I was sitting in my office. I've read everything of hers. If I were to be gaga about a celebrity, it would be her. And I look up and, oh my God, the place is packed with gang members. Everybody's sitting down in the reception area. And there under the TV, big TV that has CNN playing, is Pema Chodron. And there she is in her robes and her shaved head. And what in the hell? I couldn't even believe it. I said, called one of the homies, tell her to come in here. And she was, I just wanted to visit you. She had read my book. It was so sweet. And we sat and talked, and I said, God, I'm the biggest fan. I've read everything twice of everything you've written. And she goes, we need to get money for your place. I said, yeah, tell me about it, And well, actually, I'm being interviewed tomorrow by a very wealthy woman. What's her name? Oprah Winfred. And she said Winfred, which I thought was really charming. There are 13-year-old girls in remote villages in Africa who know what Oprah's last name is. But Pema Chodron doesn't. And I just thought that was sweet, So a thing I'm reflecting on a lot these days is the tenderness of God. So if love is the answer, community is the context, but tenderness is the methodology. It's the delivery system. And not to embarrass Michaela, but a good example always for me is Learning Works, our school that Homeboy runs. Yes, there we go. So go figure, we have 120 kids, probation, gang members. I always say they're not difficult kids to educate. They're impossible kids to educate. And they've had no success whatsoever, but they show up every day and 35 graduate each year. And the reason is simple: tenderness. And I think that's the motto, at Homeboy. Tenderness is the most foreign thing there is and the most reflective of the kind of God we have. The God who's too busy loving us to get around to disappointment. I try not to do disappointment because I know that God doesn't. And then you can say things like, well, surely God is disappointed at the fact that we could solve hunger and we don't. Or God has to be dismayed at the fact that this country, we have so many guns and folks willing to use them. Or God has to be enormously annoyed at the Roman Catholic Church for the ways that it excludes women and gay folks. And I don't believe that that's true. And that's sort of how God works. Singular, laser beam love, too busy loving to be disappointed. And the truth of that love and that tenderness is that God isn't wagging God's finger at us, but that love is helping us put our finger on it. And that's how it works. And if the world knew and felt the tenderness of God, then wouldn't we naturally solve hunger, disarm ourselves, and include people? I think that's the way it works. Otherwise, you've got this God who's shaking his head and, rolling his eyes. And what we have really is a God who loves us and invites us to be tender with each other. So you ask me a question and I don't answer it, but I'll say something.
Let's open it up. We have 10 minutes. We've got somebody who's staffing the mics. All you have to do is raise your hand. We want to get a mic to you so that we can hear you. Here's some men and women here on the front row. We want to have one of each, and then we'll keep going. Sure. First, right there. That's good.
Hello.
Where are you?
I'm over here.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm asking this question out of hopefully respect, and I'm trying to seek understanding, and it may not be interpreted that way. But
closer.
And it may not be interpreted that way. You speak so compellingly of tenderness, empathy, community, and the need for understanding. And when you refer to people you obviously have enormous disagreements with as buffoons, I don't understand. Can you help me out?
No, I as soon as as that frog leapt out of my mouth, so I apologize for that. I think it's not very helpful. Welcome to the human race. Yeah.
Next question. Yeah, John?
Thank you for being here, by the way. I have a kind of a perverse way of looking at things sometimes. So when I was coming down here to listen to you, and I know of all your work with the gangs, I was thinking, is there some way we can deal with the institutionalized gangs we call police? Maybe there's an organization we could set up. I don't know. I mean, it's just like, is it useful to consider that maybe, gangs being a response to environment, maybe police being a kind of a gang in response to an environment?
I'm going to take them real quickly.
Yeah, I think part of the thing is that if you despise the mess and the brokenness in your own wounds, chances are you're going to hate them in that other guy. And so I think part of the thing at Homeboy Industries, of the 80 senior staff we have there, is that they stand with folks in their brokenness, and that stance does not reveal to them their own superiority over these folks, but rather it reveals their own brokenness. And so I think that's an important thing, but that's a tricky thing, and there's a culture of law enforcement that's getting addressed eventually and slowly, and we need not demonize them any more than folks ought to demonize gang members. So little by little, and stuff gets changed. You can't demonize people and I guess I don't know the people at Fox News very well. So, but that's the truth. That's how it works. We endlessly have enemies working side by side with each other, and initially they'll always say, "I'll work with them, but I'm not going to talk to them." And that breaks down very, very, very quickly, always, no exceptions. And that's because once you get to know, as a homie said to me once, I guess I just needed to know his insides, which is exactly what everybody needs to know.
Yep. Where? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Rosemary, and I'm an employment specialist, and I work with one of the mental health providers in LA County. I've been doing this work for 7 years. And one time I had a client that came to me and said, I really want to work, I want to do something, but I have 11 counts against me from my, what she did back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I said, well, let's work on that. Let's see what we can do. Let's see what resources are out there. And I accessed your legal department at Homeboys Industries. Amazing, amazing team of folks that you have there. Out of the 11 counts, she got 9 of them cleaned up. And just seeing her face, the hope that created was amazing. And if it wasn't for a resource like that, I wouldn't have known how to help her. There's so many other departments, so many other resources out there, but it's so much red tape to try to support just one person. And you guys just completely opened your doors and helped her. Sorry. And this is a client I had like 4 years ago, and even to this day, just to look in her face of hope was what all of these resources that I've been able to support her with has created, including Homeboys Industries. And I thank you, and I am so glad that you guys exist. Thank you.
It's very heartening that Prop 47 passed because it, as the LA Times I think correctly said in an editorial, it indicates that we've had this major shift, from tough on crime to smart on crime. And that took a long time. I think that's taken 20 years in the making. And so the more you can foster a sense among employers who can be felony friendly, because a lot of them, at Homeboy, we don't work with the non-serious and the non-violent. We work with folks who actually on their records have violent and serious crimes. And that's why we have 18 months of healing so that they can be readied to go. So it's enough to expunge, we need to expunge, but you also need to get folks to a place where they come to terms with themselves. They re-identify who they are in the world and they're resilient as they face the world. And then employers willing to ask themselves, who would Jesus employ? Jesus would employ these folks who are a whole lot more than the worst things they've ever done.
One last question real quick. Oh, I'm sorry, you have a mic? Quick.
Do you know how scary this is to stand here like this? It's scary.
Go.
When I was 18 and not bright and not well-formed, I had an aversion about letting my children watch violent television. And they didn't turn out so well anyway. But now I'm abhorred by what the media promotes, promulgates, and insists that we do in order. It's sort of like a game. There's the bad guy and the good guy, and you have to get even. And this violence, it permeates everything and permeates my soul and everyone's, and especially people that are vulnerable and about to go off anyway. And we can't change the Second Amendment, so I don't really see what the solution would be to stop the abhorrent encouragement to brutalize your fellow person. Thank you.
But larger than that is a culture of competition where people have to win and people are at odds with each other. So the antidote, of course, is a culture of tenderness that kind of moves us to a whole other plane. About over 50 years ago, Martin Luther King wrote from the Birmingham jail, we all need to fight against the degenerating sense of nobodiness. And so the more that we can hunker down and accompany people and seek friendship with the poor, but especially those who are on the margins, and to do it with a delivery system that's soaked with tenderness, then that's the thing that in the end is the antidote to a culture of violence and competition, and somebody has to win, and there has to be good guys and bad guys.
So before we thank Greg, I want to thank you all for being here, and also put in a plug for next Sunday. Our speaker is going to be Tom Steyer, who spent, I think, something like $84 million of his money on the campaign, the midterms, trying to get some sane legislation passed and some people in office who would stand in solidarity for the planet. He's very concerned about the climate crisis. He's going to talk about what we can do, and he's also going to talk about where he comes from in terms of his own spirituality that inspires his work. So I hope you'll come and be exposed to that person. But for right now, I want to thank our friend and someone we love so very much, Greg Boyle. Thank you, brother.